Georgia's an interesting case in the post-Soviet space. It's a bit of a non-conformist. It always has been different. And so it's, on the one hand, got quite a strong tradition of pluralism, but I would say that isn't quite the same as being full democracy. So it's got a tradition of a quite lively parliament and a free press. And paradoxically, what we've seen in the last few years, we've seen this very young, modernising, dynamic government which has instituted a lot of reforms, but at the same time seems to be creating what is virtually a one-party state. Opposition parties are weak, the parliament is less powerful, they control also all the regional authorities, they control all the main TV channels, support them. So Georgia is still pluralist compared to other places, compared to Armenia, Azerbaijan or Russia, but Georgia is now facing this transition in 2012, 2013, in which I think the ruling elite has to figure out how to renew itself. Otherwise, the risk is that they become a kind of rather ossified one-party system. I think what we're seeing is that the government has instituted many modernising reforms, but we're now seeing some signs of overreach. For example, they inherited a situation back in 2003, 2004 where there was a high degree of corruption and of criminality in society. What we've seen now is that one of the most effective reforms has been against petty corruption. Now, if you want to get a driver's license, if you want to get your kid into university, you no longer basically have to pay a bribe in Georgia, and that's quite a big deal in the post-Soviet space. On the other hand, what's happened is that the police force is now extremely powerful, the most powerful institution in society. The prisons are full. Per capita, Georgia now has the fifth highest prison population in the world, after the US, Russia, and a couple of other small countries. For example, in criminal cases in Georgian courts, the acquittal rate is virtually close to zero. I think it's 0.04%. So by cracking down on corruption and criminality, which was positive, they've kind of now gone so far down that route that we're looking like a kind of benign police state in Georgia. I wrote this report, it went to press before the protests in Tbilisi last month on May 25th, 26th. When there was a hardcore group of opposition demonstrators on the streets of the capital, Tbilisi, who were obviously looking for trouble. The government wanted to hold an Independence Day parade the next day. There was a deadline to clear the streets by that morning. Now, you can understand the government position that by the end of the night they wanted to clear the streets, but what they did was extremely brutal, and we see the footage now of these heavily masked riot police moving into the streets, blocking them all off, and basically beating demonstrators very brutally. And 4 people died. A couple of them were policemen knocked over by opposition vehicles, but 4 people died overnight. And there was a lot of very brutal beating of demonstrators. People were detained. Journalists were also harassed. So this is again, although giving no credit at all to this hardcore opposition group who obviously wanted a fight, this was no good. This was no good for Georgia's attempt to have a more European tolerant image, and I think is again a symptom of a group which has been in power quite a long time and which uses the police force as its main instrument of control. What does that show us about the popularity of the government? Well, actually the opposition is not that strong, and President Saakashvili and the United National Movement are still the dominant force in the political life of the country. But I think there's a sort of growing apathy and also growing concern, particularly about economic issues, which doesn't bode well for the future. Georgia is entering a period of transition. We're going to see parliamentary elections next year in 2012. and then presidential elections in early 2013. And President Saakashvili will finish his second and last term as president at the beginning of 2013. This is a very important period. It's really the kind of the time when the post-Rose Revolution generation is up for renewal. What have they done? They've actually changing the constitution so that the strong presidency will end the moment President Saakashvili's presidency also ends, which obviously to many people doesn't look like a coincidence. There's going to be a new strong prime ministerial position. The prime minister will inherit many of the powers of the president, who will have a weaker, kind of more foreign policy type role. So this obviously raises a lot of questions. The way the electoral system works, the United National Movement, the governing party, is likely to do well in the parliamentary elections, get a majority, and they will then elect a new prime minister. So we're looking at definitely more of the same from this governing elite. The big question is whether Mikhail Saakashvili will dare to become a new prime minister, which technically he could, but which would certainly have a bad look to it and would raise questions about his legitimacy abroad, definitely. Georgia likes to present itself as a big economic success story, and you may have seen the ads in the FT or the Economist or on CNN saying Georgia's world's #1 reformer. Well, basically anyone who goes to Georgia and sees the reality there sees that that's basically a kind of rather clever PR campaign. What they have done well is on a couple of indices, particularly the ease of opening a business, that World Bank index. They're very high up the list. They've done well on anti-corruption measures. However, there are big problems within the Georgian economy, which they've done some useful reforms, but it's very much the beginning rather than the end. Inflation is extremely high. It's now about 14%. Food inflation about 30%. And agriculture has been really neglected by this government, with the result that 80% of food is now imported in what was once a rich agricultural country. Unemployment very high, because although there has been a kind of economic boom in Georgia, it's been mainly in sectors which don't employ many jobs. So unemployment in Tbilisi about 30% probably. Big challenges ahead for the Georgian economy to turn this around, to create an export sector, to revive agriculture, so the country is well capable of feeding itself and isn't doing that at the moment. At the same time, foreign direct investment, FDI, has been falling, and so there are real questions about where the money's going to come from and what is there. Do they have a long-term sustainable model? In this report I draw, it's quite schematic obviously, but I draw a triangle which is about Georgia's choices, which is obviously the title of the report. And in one corner of that triangle I call it Old Georgia. And that means, and anyone who goes to Georgia loves Old Georgia when it comes to the cultural side, or going out and meeting people, and these wonderful old traditions and the amazing ancient Orthodox Church. But when it comes to a kind of model, that means keeping things in the family, nepotism, discouraging people from going abroad. That's what the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church has done, and completely untransparent business practices. So that isn't really a model, but it is a way of doing things which still has many adherents in Georgia. The second corner of my triangle I call quote unquote Singapore. The president's talked about this a lot. He talks about we want to create Singapore in the Caucasus, and there's an ultra-liberal group who are close to many people in the United States who believe in massive deregulation, privatization of everything, free investment from around the world. And this is the model which has created success in some sectors of the Georgian economy, but not others, but this group is still quite influential. And my third corner is the European Union, and that's the kind of slow, boring business of building institutions, regulations, regulatory approximation, standards, democratic accountability, which slowly means that you converge with the EU and you follow the model of places like the Baltic states. And so what's happening is that the Georgian government is kind of flirting with all three corners, particularly the Singapore and the EU, but really can't make up its mind. And really, Singapore and the EU are actually pretty incompatible. You can't, one involves massive deregulation, the other involves regulation and institution building. And as one diplomat in Tbilisi said to me, that he calls this the Yogi Berra strategy. When you come to a fork in the road, take the fork. And they still really haven't made up their mind which road they're going to take. My conclusion basically is that really Singaporeization sounds attractive, but Georgia is still a very rural country. It's not by any means a kind of great hub. And its capacity for rapid modernization is quite small. It is a European country by geography. Its neighbors are turning to Europe. It needs an anchor, particularly because of its problems with Russia, and therefore the EU has to be the best model. But that obviously involves surrendering some of the monopoly of power in this rather informal style of government that the governing elite likes. But I think that is only basically the route they have to take. Having said that, I think they do need better help and assistance and a better communication strategy from Brussels, that this is the road to take, and from the US as well, because this will obviously involve a lot of painful regulatory reform, which costs money and which is difficult for the population. So the population has to be seen that there is light at the end of the tunnel if it goes down this process. Georgia's a very strange case. It's a country of less than 5 million people. It's a pretty poor country, and by most standards, this is not a country which would attract great interest, but it has done so, and partly this young Western educated elite has won itself a lot of friends in Washington, particularly under the last administration. There was a personal closeness between Presidents Bush and Saakashvili. Inevitably, after the disaster of the 2008 war, the relationship has cooled, but there's still a lot of people in Washington who think that Georgia needs support, who see Georgia as a kind of anti-Russia, and this in some sense still fuels the kind of enthusiasm of the Georgian elite. I really think it's time to kind of move on from that narrative, to sort of say Georgia is a country which has done some good things, but it still has a mass of problems. It's by no means a model, it's by no means a beacon of democracy. It's got some positive things going for it, but it needs a lot of conditional love. I think that's the final phrase in my report, conditional love, meaning conditionality, a lot of kind of rather tough pushing in the right direction. These people are not miracle workers, and they don't have many domestic checks and balances, so the checks and balances are external, and that really puts the responsibility on Washington and Brussels to kind of push this Georgian elite in a more democratic and accountable direction.